go ahead.
My spiritual findings. I first gave a talk with that title over 20 years ago. And then in September, I spoke with you all, some of you may have been here, about spiritual findings, where I was distinguishing spiritual findings and spiritual seeking, but trying to not separate them at the same time. For those who weren't here, you don't need to have been there in any way to follow what I'm going to do this morning, because I can sort of sum up everything that mattered the most from that other talk in a quote from the historian Yuval Harari from 21 Lessons for the 21st Century. He said, "Questions you cannot answer are usually far better than answers you cannot question." And for me, that puts the whole balance of seeking and finding into perspective. But in this perspective, we know that as Unitarian Universalists, our answers don't agree with each other often, any more than our ways of seeking or the paths or what we might count as a finding. We have different ways of searching, different things we would count as findings, and yet what I kind of emphasized back in September was that you all have found a really great spiritual found thing, and that is All Souls Unitarian Universalists, because it is really rare and wonderful for people of conflicting paths to be able to share those together. And that is genuinely, I think, what Unitarian Universalism is at its heart, and what we practice through our covenant and our presence here with each other. The point is not to settle a creed, a language of principles. It is to support one another in our spiritual growth. So today, taking from that principle, I speak to spiritual finding without apology, whatever Old Testament and other gods might think of my demoting their ego roles. Spirit is not a metaphysical entity to be debated this morning as I'm talking about it. It can be, of course, along with angels and heads of pins. But spirit, when we think about it not as something to debate as an entity, put it into this perspective. Once you have learned that things are not what matter, why would you want to make yourself a thing, even a spiritual one? Let me say this. For me, spirit, my spirit, is what animates my life. Spelled out differently in different cultures. I might be reading that in Aristotle. I might be dancing that in a Turtle Island ceremony. But it comes to the same. The spirit is what makes life alive. But why speak of finding then? If that's what spirit is, why spiritual finding? We're already alive. We know that. When is spirit, in that sense, a problem? I was struck recently by the heading in a presentation on healing for people with trauma that was called "The Steep Cost of an Unlived Life." There are, clinically, as I understand it, people who are rid of their symptoms, but who are not right, whole, healthy, back to what we would consider fully alive. In fact, one of my favorite psychologists, the kind of founder of positive psychology in the modern era, Seligman, wrote that he had started out believing that if he got rid of the symptoms, he would have a healthy patient, but all he ended up with was an empty patient when he did that. So my measure of spirit this morning for spiritual finding, for my spiritual finding, is this. How alive am I? That's my measure. If I'm in a state of being where I don't feel all the way alive, then my spirit isn't burning all the way bright. And so that's what I'm going to mean by finding today, is what sets my spirit ablaze in that sense of the word. What brings about my ability and my capacity and my exercise of being alive to the full. Not about what I believe, maybe not about what I can put into words, and not even, for the most part, about what I do. I need to be alive. I need to be alive in my being all the way. So in the over 20 years since I've given the sermon, I would certainly hope that it's a fair question that I've found something, but I have to go from a caveat. You really can't extrapolate from me to anybody else. I'm not exactly a typical case. So I'm going to tell you a bit of my story to get to my truth, and I might put chapter titles in this for the parts of it playfully, as Friedrich Nietzsche might have in some of his works. So the first part might be called Why I Had It Right from the Start. The second part might be called What Went Wrong and Why I Can Still Make It Right. And the last part will be something like How My Spirit is Finding Its Full of Life. Let's begin from this. I very recently, like within the past 48, 72 hours, watched part of a 12-part video conference that had an intriguing and attractive title to me. The title was Compassion in Therapy. What's wrong with that picture? Why should there be a presentation about compassion in therapy as if that is a special thing or technical? Shouldn't it have been a conference on when it might be necessary to objectify people with a diagnosis? Wouldn't that have been a more thing to just have the exception rather than the rule? Now, the fact that this was a special kind of thing that had to be brought out separately, had to be marketed to people with different interests, tells me something about what the setting is in our culture for the delivery of health services of different kinds and for the baseline of what we consider normal and healthy. So if I begin with what's wrong with that picture, I want to say that I might say I had it right from the start because what seemed to me before I was 20 years old.
I'm sorry.
We got that a little too close. Eileen thinks. Let me stand completely erect and speak in a voice that doesn't move the air in ways that might interfere with the paperwork before me.
This way.
Yeah. We need your spirit.
Yeah, come on.
No, I'm joking with you. You know I can't do that. You see, anyway. Before I was 20 years old, well, I was probably 15 years old when I was absolutely convinced that the way we as a culture think about the world is fundamentally wrong. That the underlying assumptions we make about science, not how science works, but how philosophers of science, popularizers of science, worldview builders out of science and out of our European Enlightenment and other things related to it, use particular findings of science to try to lock everything into a Lego block reality when it's not. And so I thought, the science is still like 19th century stuff. I hadn't read into anything advanced at that point. It just seemed like, no. Mind and body. I was fascinated by the quirky stuff and the Edgar Cayce's and the psychic stuff and the things that didn't fit the worldview because I was convinced at a very early age that there must be a deep holistic connection of mind and body within the earth of which we are part. So my way of looking at the world was much more like an indigenous Turtle Island person or some Eastern kind of thing. It didn't exactly fit the culture I was supposed to be excited about picking a job in. That was one instance of those differences. Socially, the emphasis on individual rights. By golly, a man's home is his castle. We shouldn't have to integrate. I have gun rights, etc., etc. It always seemed to me that from a social point of view, if you wanted to think about it in a way that I'm just going to say that made sense. You have to have a community before you can have individuals that survive to the age of 3 months. And so to put the community first in some sense of the word just made sense. So I would say as an example, even when there is a value that is a good value that we uphold in our culture, we do it wrong. And the example I'm thinking of at the moment would be responsibility. Important stuff. But we link responsibility to causality. And so if you had something happen to you that was not your fault. Either you're responsible for that, which means you can take your life in your own hands and live forward in some way or other, but you have to kind of own that it must have been you that contributed to the cause. Wrong. Or you say it was somebody else, and therefore, what can I do? I'm just a victim. So to me, thinking about responsibility in those terms forces people who aren't coloring entirely within the lines to define themselves and their lives in ways that undermines their ability to actually live responsibly from that point of view. So it seemed to me early on, if you turn it upside down, we're going to be closer to what would seem right. I mean, when I was young, I didn't watch a lot of cowboy stuff, but I rooted for the Indians, you know. So I was right. I'm convinced about my philosophy of the world, of life, of values and meaning. I was right to identify mystics and spirit leaders as pointing a truer way. But how to be that truth? Now I would say spiritual finding is coming home. I would say that the biggest growth that I have experienced spiritually has been a kind of unburdening, an offloading of alien things, impositions, and twisted forms that I've taken on myself in order to accommodate a world that isn't natural to me and that wants me to become unnatural, I think quite literally. Some of this is because of how exchanges happen. Imagine that you're haggling over buying a car. I recently bought a new car and loved the experience and the outcome, but they set the sticker price. And so when there's a discussion about what's going to happen, they have set what the starting point for the discussion is. In our culture, often the starting point is set either with the status quo. Well, this is just the way things are. So if you want to say anything should be different, you tell me what. There's a great line in a song. I just heard, you would love this song. I think it's either Keisha or Kia, but the song is called Rich White Straight Men. And it's like, what if rich white straight men didn't rule the world? But there's a line in there. If you ride a unicorn to school and then you fall off, you have health care. No, you don't. So the idea of like, well, why shouldn't people have health care? You know, well, you have to understand how things are. So when you start from how things are, then the status quo is bending the conception of what is appropriate to even think about. Or more frequently in media politics, the status quo is a kind of meta status quo. Regardless of who's in power, the controversy becomes, should it be the Republican or the Democratic platform? I call it the McNeil-Lehrer fallacy, that there's truth in approximately equal doses on both sides, though it's been decades since they were the people implementing that. In any case, I would say that I have had to live my entire process of adult maturation in a rigged cage, subject to skewed and often random reinforcements designed to break me from my nature and train me to anti-natural patterns of behavior. A stronger example of that would be when they've analyzed arms that were found on battlefields in terms of how many were discharged and how many were loaded at the time, in terms of how long it takes to load and what you would have predicted. Prior to the war in Vietnam, there was a phenomenal percentage of undischarged loaded firearms. Like, people were really reluctant to shoot at each other for some reason. I don't get it. I mean, that's what you're there for, is to kill each other. And the point that was made by the people I saw that analyzing this is that it goes against our nature to do that. So realizing that, when they trained people for the Vietnam War, they did a better job of dehumanizing the process of the person who was going to pull the trigger. So that's the kind of thing that, in a much less extent, I've experienced myself. what went wrong? I was definitely ADHD from the start. My sister, who's a licensed clinical social worker, says the whole family is, and that's just the culture. But I was not post-traumatic stress. I was not pre-traumatic stress. I was not lots of adverse childhood events. PTSD came along later. My career goal was to teach philosophy. Teaching being a way to help and to share and to promote growth, philosophy being the most fundamental perspective on life, on culture, on anything else. Okay, I have plans, but no and no. Okay, well, how many of you could see me as a born salesman?
No. Okay.
I don't think so. So that wasn't exactly a good fit, but when you're in sales, you got it anyway. A lot of life was like that. It was workable, then unemployed, then workable, then I was thriving, and I got a new boss who put me in the most contorting and twisting and crippling cage of all. It was solitary when I had been the lead person before. I was not introduced to my coworkers. It was working from home at a time that was very hard for me as an ADHD person who connects with people. So interesting to me that I could go through denial of tenure, not getting an interview for my own job, all kinds of stuff, and still be plugging along. I got plans for those so-called failures. It was in my 60s when someone was able not to break my spirit, but to break my agency, to break my resiliency, to break my ability to feel the fullness of the spirit that I never conceded. Because in trauma work, one of the things that comes out is a person, especially young people who are being traumatized, often face a choice if the events are coming from someone that's in their family unit, someone that's a loved one. Either that person is at fault, and you cannot rely on this crucial relationship in your life. You give up the bond. Even if you pretend not to, you've given up a bond. Or somehow, you don't need to understand how, you must somehow be at fault because the bond has to stay. And what most people subject to that do is they internalize that fault in one way, shape, or form. I never did. I think because of when the different traumas hit me. My point being, because my spirit was never broken, even into my 60s and beyond, I can, in a way that's very difficult for people who can still approach, say, post-traumatic resiliency, I can now, to put it in simple terms, make it right. I can use this part of my life where I don't have to work for slave wages anymore, but I've still got all my fires burning intellectually and in my other skill sets. And what that means is that now I can bring the strengths that I have cultivated in an alien sort of world to my spirit's tasks. So what that means is, for me, as I think about things in terms of being fully alive, that the things that I rattled off quickly as a bullet list at the end of a September sermon, these become things I'm capable of reaching for in my day-to-day being. But I begin with one that I didn't mention before because it's the starting point. I must be present. If I am attending to the past, to a future that's not here yet, to an elsewhere, I cannot have my intention and attention on the reality of the moment of my being. And I want to suggest in ways that many teachers have recognized that it's only in the here and now that we have being at all. Anything else is some form of a projection, a retrojection, call it what you will. So when I am present, I had first said in an earlier version of this, to be free has been the greatest finding for me, because the burdens of traumatic experiences, the patterns, the habits, the way I had rigged my personality through years of so-called maturation and immaturity, actually, the way I had formed myself was sort of wrong. And so that was twisting me and weighting me down. It's like I was wearing a weighted blanket that didn't fit. And so to be free of that was what struck me the most as the being of my spirit finding a home. However, I can't say that the point is to be free, because that isn't something you can just turn on and off, or I wouldn't have been this long in therapy and still going. It's to become free. What we can be without having to become. We can be mindful, we can be attentive, we can have a good attitude, we can have intentions of certain kinds. But to be free is a little bit like you're accomplishing some of that unburdening, which I felt. What we can be is open. We can be perceptive and attentive and receptive to our worlds. We can be fluid within the limits of the channels we have cut for ourselves. We can be adaptive when we're in the moment to whatever intuitively and immediately seems to beckon to our spirit. And we can be open to mystery and to awe without having to define it or reject it or be critical of it or categorize it. We can be open to others, caring and empathetic, not based on whatever our inborn temperament was, but what our intention is for the life that will bring our spirits to their full aliveness. I can be engaged, because if I am disengaged, I may think I'm being open, but if I'm not engaged, I'm not connecting. I live in a world, and I do not want to say of myself, I am in it, but not of it. Why shouldn't I be of it? People who say that you shouldn't be of the world don't give the world enough credit for what life brings and what it offers and what those possibilities are in every moment, no matter how bleak it may seem. And so I do want to be of the world and of life. And to do that, to be engaged, when we use that word in the context of a relationship, engagement is a commitment. It's an intention to be married, but in the sense of a commitment. I want the way that I have my being in the world to be committed to that engagement with this world of which I am, for me, an inseparable part. I don't want to be standing back kind of gauging what the opportunities are. I want to be in and of it. My attitude, regardless of temperament, I want to be positive, partly because empirical studies have shown tremendous benefits for that outlook on life, regardless of your temperament, and ways that you can cultivate an attitude of positivity. It's like faith. If I were a person of a different religious denomination who was committed to a creed, I might have faith in a deity or about a set of beliefs of salvation or something like that. I don't have any of that. I've not needed any of that. What I have is a deep down intuitive certainty that whatever lights my life up, whatever in Rumi's poem gets called divine, that I have an unshakable connection with that. And that is faith. But it could be faith in life without anything beyond immediate experience, however one wanted to take that. So being positive lets me enjoy. That openness then becomes an openness where I'm expecting the best, and thereby making it more likely that the good flows toward me out of my own intention. In fact, I could give you an analysis, which I don't have time for, about the dorsal and ventral vagal systems in the evolution of our central nervous system, and how it's the forward-looking vagus that's related to the facial musculature, and that other people read intuitively about us, and therefore our signal to the rest of the world for how to engage with us is already set by what part of our nervous system has been activated, which is often a function of experiences and of fight or flight or things that are even more primordial than that. The last thing I want to point out about my being in this sense, which really fits with me, the philosopher, even though mostly I've been reading psychology stuff lately. Be meaningful. Viktor Frankl, the psychiatrist, philosopher, concentration camp victim, the victim isn't the best word for it, survivor, I meant. Viktor Frankl noted that when we have a why, we can live with almost any what. But absent that sense of why, those were the people who died the most easily, or who had the least will to live. And I might say perhaps the least spark of life. So as I tie those things up into my being and what I'm finding for myself, it is a process. But my process isn't going to be like anyone else's. What I think my finding has that may be like somebody else's is that to be most fully alive is in part to let go of all the stuff we thought we were supposed to be. To let go all of the stuff, not all of it, that's too big an ask. To let go of much of what we have trained ourselves to be, to conform. I wasn't going to read this because of time, but I have to, even though it's an ADHD thing. Edward Hallowell, from the book Delivered from Distraction, writes, he's talking about his own experience with attention deficit. He says, it seems to me that if anyone has a disorder, you can see where this is going. It seems to me that if anyone has a disorder, it's the people who plod along paying close attention to every little speck and crumb, every little detail, every minor policy and procedure, and every minuscule manual. I meant to say before I started reading this, I don't want to pick on anybody's personality type. That part to me is like, all right, so they're in the detail. This is where the point comes. I think these are the people who have a disorder. I call it attention surplus disorder. They did exactly what they were told as children, told on others who did not, and now make a living doing what they're told, telling others what to do, and telling on those who don't. That's the part that yeah. So for my process of spiritual finding, there was a lot of that coming to terms with living outside the lines proudly, openly, without pulling any punches. And it's through that process, in a Socratic sense of being myself, one might even say, that I've come to feel most in touch with the real power of the spirit that I am, that so badly scared the shit out of some people they had to get me out of the corporate culture, even though I was the best person on the job. So, may you all find your spirit as alive as you ever have in these wonderful days to come. Thank you.
Thank you.